one of the things that I've found, especially conversationally, so I was in a polyamorous relationship for close to 8 years.
Mm.
And one of the things that reliably gets you into flow is the novelty of the first few dates that you're with somebody new, right?
Yeah.
There's this novelty, like you don't think about your phone, you don't think about any other thing. You're in rapturous attention to their story, their autobiographical story, whatever that is, you're right there with them. And then you're sharing, for the first time, your stuff, which is not, and it drives you. And I think that's one of the things that people love so much about that is it's not so much the other person. It's the fact that the interaction with that other person is driving you into a flow state because you're present. It's like, oh, now I'm really present because of these other factors.
Yes.
And in a relationship with someone that you've been with a long time, now I'm in a monogamous marriage with my wife and I'm so happy and I love her. But we have to create situations that actually provide some novelty. And I think with a little bit more intention about that. And so I guess I would love your comment on novelty in general as a cool flow trigger. And because it can create this sense also novelty in environment, you're in a new place, you get this sense of wonder and awe, which is correlated with this, or novelty with the person and this new intimacy. But you can still create that with the same person, but it has to be a little bit more intentional. It's not just going to be situational. It's going to have to be more intentional to get to those states.
Yeah.
Just like we did with our conversation, right? Like having that type of conversation with your closest friend, all of a sudden it's novel and all of a sudden you're right there in it.
That's exactly right. I think you answered your own question, but let me comment on it. I'm pretty convinced of the hypothesis. The reason why some of our functioning is conscious as opposed to most of our functioning, which is unconscious and intelligent, but the reason why we have conscious functioning is that consciousness is about dealing with novelty, complexity, and ill-defined as opposed to well-defined problems. And so the degree to which you can bring those features into any situation is the degree to which you're going to start engaging consciousness, that sense of being present. So I think that's very reasonable. But I think there's also something, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, there's also something, and you can see this in things like Buddhism or Taoism, the mystical aspects of Sufism, or Sufism as a whole is mystical, traditions within Christianity, for example, is coming to a place where you realize that everything, and saying this as a sentence is easy, but that's not the point. You realize that everything is ultimately complex and ill-defined and novel to you, even the most familiar of objects. And getting to a place, and I think this is properly a virtue that has to be cultivated. I think this is what reverence is about, so that you can come into a room and know that there's a combinatorial explosive amount of information and patterns and intelligibility, and all of those have the capacity to trigger different aspects of you, and you could do mutually accelerating disclosure in so many dimensions. You can know all of that like this, but that doesn't mean that you've cultivated the virtue of being able to engage in it. And so I think you can both look for ways of enhancing in any particular situation the novelty, the ill-definedness, and the complexity, but you can also properly cultivate the virtue within a worldview, right, that makes that more and more, transferable to more and more context, where you can go into a situation and you're much more likely to fall into wonder about that situation.
That's beautiful, because every human being is a hyperobject. It does have all of all of that complexity, and so with choosing to recognize the novelty of any situation, just as Heraclitus talked about the river, no man steps in the same river twice, because it's not the same river and he's not the same man. It's not going to the same old river. It's a new river and it's a new you. And if you choose to recognize that novelty and choose to have reverence for this new experience, it's a practice. It's not going to click in automatically. It's not that kind of gross, massive thing that happens when something is actually radically novel, like all of a sudden you're in a hot air balloon and you've never been in a hot air balloon. But, to take the power back to say, no, we can make this a choice. is so valuable for any relationship and for life itself.
And if you'll allow me, I want to riff on that in one dimension.
Mm-hmm.
Notice that, and you made a contrast between when you're polyamorous and now you're monogamous, right? And there's a sense in which you being faithful to your wife is not you believing things about her without evidence. It's the commitment you just made. I'm committed to a continuity of contact. It's always going to try and, engender mutual wonder, open things up between us. So that's what faithfulness is, as opposed to, I believe things without evidence about my spouse. What? I don't know. But if you're telling me what you mean by that is I'm committed, because this is how I feel about my partner, I'm committed to try and do that what you just described so beautifully a few minutes ago. I'm committed to doing that. I'm committed, sati, I'm going to remember, mindful, I'm going to remember that this person is ultimately, and not in words, but in practice, cultivating a virtue. I'm going to remember that this person is mysterious. I'm going to remember that they're complex. I'm going to remember that they're going to exceed any definition that I give of them. They're ill-defined. And I'm going to engage and commit to mutually accelerating disclosure and vulnerability about acknowledging that, because that makes that person in some ways unpredictable to me and surprising and sometimes scary. And that's what faithfulness is. And I'm suggesting this for a reason, is that we could bring back a notion of faith that is more about faithfulness to reality, as opposed to the assertion of beliefs without evidence. That's something I just wanted to suggest.
Yeah, beautifully said.